All right, so let's dive into a pretty wild what if today.
Yeah.
What if Canada wasn't just our friendly neighbor to the north,
Right.
but instead, what if they became like the 51st state
Hmm.
part of the U.S.?
Wow.
We found this article, and it explores this whole hypothetical scenario.
Okay.
And trust me, it gets really complicated really quickly.
I bet.
Just imagine going to Banff National Park.
Yeah.
No passport needed.
Oh, wow.
But then suddenly you have to figure out the U.S. healthcare system.
Right.
Now, look, we're not here to say if this merger is a good idea or a bad idea.
Okay.
What we're going to do is we're going to unpack all the crazy ripple effects of something like this happening,
I like it.
you know?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought experiment
Yeah.
because it really makes you think about all the implications.
Right.
It's like on everything,
Yep.
from the economy and the military to healthcare and culture.
Totally.
And the article does a good job of presenting these potential consequences,
Right.
but without actually like taking a side.
Yeah. And I think that's important.
Totally.
Okay, so first things first.
I
We're
got
talking
it.
about adding a huge chunk of land to the U.S.
Canada's landmass is massive, like second only to Russia.
Wow.
And if it were to become like part of the U.S.,
Right.
that would suddenly make the U.S. the largest country in the world.
Right.
By far. Like
Right.
covering something like 80% of North America.
80%, that's almost the entire continent.
I know.
So what would that even mean for the U.S.?
Right.
In terms of like global power?
I mean, geographically, it would be a total game changer
Yeah.
because the U.S. would control the majority of the Arctic,
Right.
which is becoming increasingly important for a few reasons.
Oh, okay.
You know, as the ice melts, new shipping routes are opening up,
Wow.
and there's a ton of potential for accessing all this untapped oil and gas.
Oh, yeah?
Plus, there's the whole military aspect.
Right.
Controlling the Arctic would give the U.S. a huge strategic advantage.
So we're not just talking about, adding some pretty mountains to the U.S. landscape.
I guess
This would
that's-
have major geopolitical consequences.
Absolutely. And speaking of military power,
Okay.
the U.S. would also get Canada's entire armed forces.
Oh, wow.
That's an additional 100,000 soldiers plus fighter jets,
Wow.
submarines, the whole nine yards.
It's like adding a whole new branch to the military.
It really is.
Okay, so we've got this massive new territory
Uh-huh.
and all this added military power.
Right.
But what about the economic impact?
Right.
I mean, Canada has a lot of natural resources, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. Oil, minerals, fresh water, you name it. It's a massive resource package.
Wow.
Plus, Canada has a highly educated workforce
Oh, right.
and a super stable financial system.
Okay.
So on paper, at least,
Go.
it looks like a major economic boost for the U.S.
It sounds like winning the lottery.
Yeah.
But I know the article also mentions some potential downsides,
It does.
especially for Canada.
Yeah.
What are those?
Well, one concern is what happens to all the Canadian businesses and workers when they suddenly have to compete
Right.
with these giant American corporations.
Oh, yeah. I hadn't thought about that.
There's a big risk of economic dominance,
Yeah.
you know,
Mm.
where the U.S. economy benefits,
Right.
but then it leads to job losses
Oh, wow.
and a decline in all the local industries up in Canada.
So it's not just adding Canada's economy to the U.S. economy.
Right.
There would be some winners and losers.
For sure.
And speaking of potential losers, we can't forget about healthcare.
Right. Healthcare, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Because Canada has universal healthcare,
Right.
and it's a huge part of their national identity.
Yeah.
So what happens when that clashes with the U.S. system?
That's a good question. Canadians seem pretty attached to their healthcare.
They do.
What does the article suggest could happen?
Well, it lays out a few scenarios,
Okay.
and none of them are ideal.
Okay.
One possibility is that you'd have all these Americans
Right.
flooding into Canada seeking cheaper health care,
Oh,
and that could overwhelm their system.
right.
Another possibility is that Canada would be forced to adopt a more privatized U.S.-style system.
So either Canadians are stuck with a healthcare system they don't want,
Right.
or their current system just collapses
Exactly.
because of all the Americans coming in.
Yeah, it's a big deal for them.
Yeah.
And that's just one example
Ah.
of the massive social and political changes
Oh, yeah.
this merger would trigger.
Yeah.
It's not just about economics and geography. It gets
Okay.
into some really fundamental questions
Yeah.
about national identity and values.
Totally. We were talking about healthcare and how a merger with the U.S. could really change things for Canadians.
Yeah,
And it makes me wonder what other everyday changes would Canadians face?
right.
Like if they woke up one morning and they were Americans.
Well, for starters, they'd have to say goodbye to the loony and the toonie. and get used to using U.S. dollars.
Right.
And, while the Canadian dollar is pretty strong, there would likely be some, economic volatility as the two currencies merge.
Makes sense. So what about taxes?
Yeah.
Would Canadians suddenly get hit with the U.S. tax system?
It's very likely.
Okay.
Currently, Canadians generally pay a bit more in taxes than Americans,
Okay.
but they also get more robust social services.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's a trade-off there.
Right.
Americans might see a slight tax increase to cover expanding those social programs to include Canadians,
Right.
while Canadians might actually see their taxes go down a bit.
Okay.
But they could lose some of those safety nets.
Right.
So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, for sure. There are potential winners and losers on both sides
Absolutely.
when it comes to taxes.
Yeah.
But what about language?
Well, yeah.
Would everyone in the U.S. suddenly need to brush up on their French
Right.
to talk to their new Quebecois neighbors?
That's a really interesting question, and it gets to the heart of all the cultural complexities of this merger. The article suggests that the U.S. might have to adopt some kind of bilingual policy, at least for official government business,
Wow.
to accommodate all the French-speaking Canadians.
So this merger could spark a nationwide debate about language and identity
Oh, absolutely.
in the U.S.
Mhm.
What about other states with big non-English speaking populations?
Right.
Could this have ripple effects beyond just French?
Absolutely. Think about states with large Spanish-speaking populations.
Yeah.
For example,
Yeah.
this whole scenario could really force some important conversations about inclusivity and representation in the U.S.
Yeah, it sounds like merging two countries with such distinct cultures
Right.
wouldn't be a simple process.
Not at all.
Are there concerns about tensions arising between different regions?
Canada has a really strong sense of regional identity,
Yeah.
with some provinces feeling politically and culturally distinct
Right.
from the rest of the country.
Mm.
The article highlights provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan,
Okay.
which are really rich in resources like oil,
Right.
as potential hotspots for this kind of thing.
So the Texas of Canada.
You could say that these provinces might demand more autonomy, within this new American system. It's not hard to imagine some political friction,
Yeah.
and maybe even calls for secession from some areas that don't feel represented or heard.
So a merger might not just create a bigger America,
Right?
but a more divided America.
That's a real possibility, and it really underscores the need to consider not just the economic and political ramifications, but also the human and cultural factors.
Totally.
A successful merger would require a deep understanding or respect for Canada's unique history, values, and all those regional differences.
It's not just redrawing borders on a map.
Exactly.
It's about people's lives.
Right.
It really makes you think about whether a true national identity could emerge from merging two places that are so distinct. Is that even possible?
It's a great question, and honestly, there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
The article doesn't offer any specific solutions.
Right.
But it does emphasize the need for a well-planned transition that involves addressing everything from currency conversion and tax harmonization to language policy and regional autonomy.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It would be a massive undertaking, for sure.
What would even be the first step in figuring all of this out?
Well, one crucial element would be communication.
Okay.
It's essential to have open and honest dialogue with the people who would be most affected by this change.
Right.
Canadians and Americans. Their concerns, their aspirations, their voices need to be at the center of any successful transition plan.
Okay.
It would take an immense amount of political will, compromise, and foresight to make this work.
It seems like this hypothetical scenario is less about could this happen and more about should this happen.
You've hit on a key point.
Yeah, perhaps this whole thought experiment serves as a cautionary tale. It highlights the potential dangers of pursuing power and expansion without fully considering the human and cultural consequences.
Yeah.
True unity can't be forced.
Right.
It has to be built on shared values, mutual respect, and a genuine desire to create something better together.
So we've explored the potential benefits, the challenges, and just the sheer complexity of merging two distinct nations with their own histories, values, and identities.
Right.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
Where do we even go from here? with this thought experiment.
Yeah.
Wow, we spent this whole episode imagining what it would be like if Canada just became part of the U.S.
I know, it's wild, right?
And we've uncovered, some possible upsides, a lot more downsides, honestly.
Right.
And it's really made me look at both countries differently.
Yeah, it's been fascinating.
We've explored like all the benefits, the challenges.
Right. The crazy complexity of merging these two nations with their own histories and values and identities.
It's a lot.
But now I'm curious, like, putting aside if this is even a good idea, what can we even learn from this whole thought experiment? What bigger questions does this raise about the future of North America or even the world?
Well, I think this scenario makes us rethink the whole idea of national sovereignty, especially in a world that's constantly changing like ours. Globalization, technology, climate change. All of these are blurring borders and making countries more interdependent. And it makes you wonder if the traditional idea of a nation state is even relevant anymore.
So you're saying this whole Canada-U.S. merger, even though it's just hypothetical, it makes us question like how we organize ourselves as humans on a global scale.
Exactly. Look, we're already seeing the rise of these regional blocks like the European Union.
Oh, right.
Where countries are like pooling their sovereignty to tackle shared challenges and compete globally. So it makes you wonder, could North America be headed in that direction?
That's a huge shift, though.
It would be.
Instead of individual countries, we might see these super regions with their own economic and political systems.
Right.
What would a North American bloc even look like?
Right.
Would Mexico be involved?
That's a great question. The article doesn't go into that specific scenario.
Okay.
But it does highlight the strong economic ties that already exist between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico through things like USMCA.
Right.
A closer political union would definitely build on those relationships.
So we're talking like a superpower of superpowers.
Potentially.
But wouldn't that create even more challenges?
Probably.
Imagine trying to navigate the cultural and linguistic diversity, the economic disparities, the political differences.
For sure.
It just seems like a recipe for disaster.
You're raising some very valid concerns.
Yeah.
Creating a truly integrated North American bloc would require a lot of cooperation, compromise, and cultural sensitivity that we honestly haven't seen a lot of lately.
Yeah, the political climate in both the U.S. and Canada right now.
I know.
It seems more about division than unity.
Yeah.
So maybe this hypothetical merger is less about what could happen.
Right.
And more about what shouldn't happen.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Perhaps this whole thought experiment is a cautionary tale. Highlighting the dangers of chasing power and expansion without really thinking about the human and cultural costs.
Totally.
True unity, it can't be forced.
No.
It has to be built on shared values, mutual respect, and a real desire to create something better together.
This whole conversation has really changed my perspective.
Yeah.
Not just on Canada, but on what it even means to be part of a nation in today's world.
It's more than just lines on a map.
Right. It's about the people, the cultures, the history, and the vision for the future.
It's a good reminder that even the craziest thought experiments can give us these profound insights into the complex challenges and opportunities we face.
Yeah, as a global community.
Exactly.
So to all our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this final thought.
Okay.
If you had the power to redraw the map of North America, what would you do? What kind of future would you create?
Good question.
What lessons from this merger would you keep in mind?
Right.
Let us know in the comments.
Yeah.
We're always excited to dive deeper into the conversation with all of you.